There are nights when the rain falls with a certain intensity, as if it's trying to wash away more than just the dirt and grime of the world. It was on such a night, with the storm raging and the wind howling through the trees, that Thomas found himself all alone. The kind of night where the shadows seem darker and the unknown lurks just beyond the edge of sight. Thomas had been driving home from work, the rain pounding against his car, making it almost impossible to see the road ahead. The wipers struggled to keep up, and the headlights barely pierced the curtain of water. Suddenly, his car sputtered and died, leaving him stranded on a lonely, rain-soaked road. With no other option, Thomas decided to seek shelter until the storm passed. He spotted a dim light in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain. As he approached, he realized it was an old, abandoned house, the kind that should have been left to rot years ago. But with the storm growing more violent, Thomas knew he had no choice but to take refuge inside. The door creaked open with a loud groan, and Thomas stepped into the musty darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Lightning flashed outside, momentarily illuminating the room, and that's when he saw it, a large ornate mirror standing in the corner. It seemed out of place, almost as if it had been left behind on purpose. Thomas felt an odd pull towards the mirror, as if it were calling to him. He wiped the dust off the glass, revealing his reflection. But something was off. The reflection didn't move in sync with him. Instead, it seemed to have a life of its own. Thomas blinked, and in that instant, the reflection changed. Raindrops from the storm outside began to splash against the mirror's surface. With each drop, the reflection shifted, showing him glimpses of alternate realities. At first, the images were mundane. Thomas sitting in his car, waiting out the storm. But then, the scenes grew darker. He saw himself lost in the woods, pursued by shadowy figures. Another raindrop, and he was trapped in the burning house, flames licking at his feet. Panic began to set in as the mirror showed him more and more terrifying futures, each scene more horrific than the last. He saw himself standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind pushing him closer to the abyss. In another, he was buried alive, the earth closing in around him. The mirror's power was undeniable, and Thomas realized that it wasn't just showing him possibilities, it was forcing him to choose. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a banshee, and the rain pelted the windows with fury. Thomas knew he had to make a decision, but every choice seemed to lead to a gruesome end. The mirror's reflection taunted him, showing him over and over the consequences of each possible action. Desperation clawed at him as he tried to think of a way out. He backed away from the mirror, but the pull was too strong. It was as if the mirror itself was alive, feeding off his fear. The more he resisted, the more it showed him his doom. Thomas could feel the walls closing in, the air growing colder and thicker with each passing second. Then, in a moment of clarity, he realized the mirror wasn't just showing him his future, it was giving him a choice. If he could find the right path, he might escape the horrors that awaited him. But time was running out, and the storm outside raged on, as if it were in league with the mirror, urging him to make a decision. Thomas stepped closer to the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared into the glass, watching as the rain continued to reveal alternate realities. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong choice, and it could all be over. The images flickered rapidly now, one terrifying scene after another, and Thomas could barely keep up. But then, amidst the chaos, he saw a glimpse of hope. One reality showed him walking away from the house, untouched by the horrors that had consumed the others. It was a narrow path, treacherous and dark, but it was the only way out. Thomas knew he had to act quickly before the mirror showed him something worse. He took a deep breath and made his choice. As he turned away from the mirror, the storm outside seemed to reach a crescendo. The wind howled louder, the rain pounded harder, and the house groaned under the pressure. But Thomas didn't look back. He walked out of the house into the storm, knowing that the mirror's grip on him had finally been broken. The rain washed over him, cold and relentless, but it didn't matter. He was free. But as he reached his car, something made him pause. He glanced back at the old house, its dark windows staring back at him. And in that moment, he realized that the mirror had shown him only one of many possibilities. The rain continued to fall, each drop a reminder of the choices he had yet to make. Some objects carry with them the weight of their history, and not all histories are meant to be uncovered. On a stormy night, with the wind howling like a wounded animal, Victoria found herself alone in her grandmother's attic. The old house, creaking under the pressure of the storm, seemed alive with memories that had long been forgotten. Victoria had always been drawn to the attic, a place where her grandmother's secrets were hidden away. As a child, she had often played among the dusty relics, imagining stories for each item she found. But tonight, something was different. The storm outside was relentless, and the attic felt colder than usual, as if it were holding its breath. While rummaging through an old trunk, Victoria found it. A raincoat folded neatly at the bottom, its dark fabric glistening, despite the years of neglect. She didn't remember ever seeing it before, but something about it felt familiar, almost as if it had been waiting for her. Without thinking, Victoria slipped the raincoat on. The moment the fabric touched her skin, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The coat was heavy, much heavier than it looked, and a strange, oppressive feeling settled over her. She tried to shrug it off as nothing more than the chill of the attic, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The first memory hit her like a wave. She was no longer in the attic, but standing on a cliffside, the rain lashing at her face. The wind was fierce, threatening to knock her off balance, and the sea below rolled like a beast hungry for its next victim. In a flash, she realized she wasn't herself anymore. She was someone else, someone who had stood here before. The memory ended as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Victoria gasping for breath. She tore at the raincoat, desperate to remove it, but the fabric clung to her like a second skin. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't take it off. It was as if the coat had become a part of her. Another memory flooded her mind. This time, she was in a dense forest, the rain pouring down in sheets. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. She was running, fear propelling her forward. Something was chasing her, something unseen but undeniably there. Victoria could feel the terror of the person whose memory she was experiencing. The heartbeat in her ears wasn't her own, but it pounded with the same intensity. She stumbled, falling into the mud, and the memory ended with a violent jolt. Back in the attic, Victoria was trembling, her mind reeling from the horror she had just lived through. The raincoat was cursed. She knew that now. It carried the memories of every person who had worn it before her, each one meeting a tragic end. And now, those memories were becoming hers. She could feel their fear, their pain, and she knew that unless she found a way to break the curse, she would suffer the same fate. The next memory came, and it was worse than the others. She was trapped in a car, the rain hammering against the windows. The seat belt wouldn't unbuckle, and the doors were jammed. Panic rose as the water began to rise inside the car, the relentless rain flooding everything in its path. Victoria gasped for air as the memory released her. She was back in the attic, but the terror lingered. The raincoat was suffocating, its weight crushing her, and she knew she couldn't take much more. But the memories kept coming, each one more horrific than the last. In another, she was in a small, dimly lit room, the walls closing in on her. The sound of dripping water echoed around her, growing louder and more insistent. She was alone, completely alone, with no escape. The room filled with water, and she struggled to breathe, knowing it was hopeless. Victoria was losing herself. The memories were blending together, becoming her own. The raincoat had her in its grip, and it wouldn't let go. She clawed at the fabric, her nails digging into the material, but it was no use. The raincoat had become a part of her. Desperate, she stumbled down the attic stairs, the memories still assaulting her mind. She could barely see through the tears and the flashes of other people's lives. But she knew she had to get out, had to find a way to break the curse. Outside, the storm raged on. The rain pounded against the ground, the wind howling through the trees. Victoria could feel the pull of the raincoat dragging her towards the storm. She knew that if she didn't do something soon, she would become just another memory trapped within its cursed fabric. With the last of her strength, she made her way to the edge of the property where the old well stood. The well had always been a source of fear for her, a place where bad things had happened. She could feel the raincoat tightening around her, the memories coming faster now, more intense. In a final act of defiance, Victoria hurled herself towards the well, the raincoat pulling her down. She felt the cold water engulf her, pulling her into the darkness. The memories were relentless, drowning her in fear and despair. But as the water closed over her head, something changed. The raincoat began to loosen, its grip weakening. The memories faded, and for the first time since putting it on, Victoria felt a sense of peace. She broke the surface of the water, gasping for air, the raincoat slipping from her shoulders. It sank into the depths of the well, taking the cursed memories with it. Victoria crawled out of the well, drenched and exhausted, but free. As she looked back at the house, she knew she had escaped a fate worse than death. The rain still fell, the storm still raged, but Victoria was no longer afraid. The curse had been broken, but she knew she would never forget the horror of the cursed raincoat and the lives it had claimed. The weeping windows. There are houses that hold on to their pasts, where the very walls seem to breathe with memories long buried. On a night when the rain fell like tears from a grieving sky, Grace and her daughter Eerie found themselves in such a house. The storm raged outside, but the real terror was just beginning to stir within. The old house, nestled deep in the countryside, had been a new start for them. Grace, seeking to escape the pain of the past, had moved to this secluded place, hoping for peace. The rain had been falling since they arrived, a constant downpour that seemed to echo the sadness she had tried to leave behind. As the evening wore on, the storm grew fiercer. Grace was unpacking boxes in the living room when she noticed something strange. The windows, large and old-fashioned, were covered in condensation. But it wasn't just the usual fogging from the cold rain. These windows seemed to be weeping. Grace wiped at the glass, expecting to feel the cool dampness of the mist, but her hand came away wet. The windows weren't just fogged, they were crying. Thick, salty tears streamed down the panes, as if the house itself was mourning. A shiver ran down Grace's spine as she backed away from the glass, a sense of dread creeping into her heart. Eerie, who had been playing in her room, came down the stairs, her small face pale and frightened. She told her mother that she had heard whispers coming from the walls, voices that spoke of sorrow and loss. Grace tried to reassure her daughter, telling her it was just the wind. But even as she spoke the words, she didn't believe them. The storm outside pounded against the house with a fury, the wind howling through the trees like a wailing spectre. The weeping windows seemed to cry harder, the tears flowing freely now, creating small puddles on the floor. Grace felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, a deep sorrow that seemed to seep into her very bones. It wasn't long before the whispers that Eerie had mentioned began to fill the house. Soft, mournful voices that drifted through the air like a cold breeze. Grace could hear them now, the voices of those who had once lived here. The sadness in their words was palpable, a sorrow so profound that it felt as though the house itself was grieving. The windows continued to weep, the tears growing heavier, more insistent. Grace knew she had to do something, but what could she do against a house that was alive with mourning? She tried to ignore the voices, the crying windows, but they seemed to grow louder, more desperate. Eerie clung to her mother, her small body trembling with fear. The voices were all around them now, filling the rooms with their sorrowful lament. Grace could feel the weight of the house's grief pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. The memories of the past inhabitants began to seep into Grace's mind. She could see them, a family much like her own, who had once called this house home. But their lives had been cut short, their happiness turned to despair. The house had absorbed their sorrow, and now it was sharing it with Grace and Eerie. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, the rain lashing against the house with relentless force. The weeping windows rattled in their frames, as if they were trying to escape the weight of their tears. Grace knew she had to act, but every step felt like wading through thick, suffocating grief. She gathered Eerie in her arms, determined to leave the house before it consumed them both. But as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pleading with Grace to stay, to listen to their sorrow. The house didn't want them to leave. It wanted them to share in its grief, to become a part of the endless mourning that had trapped the souls of the past. The windows wept harder, the tears now pouring down in torrents, soaking the floors, filling the house with the salty scent of sadness. Grace could feel herself being pulled into the house's sorrow, the overwhelming grief threatening to drown her. But she couldn't let that happen. She had to save Eerie, had to get her out of this cursed place before it was too late. With a strength born of desperation, Grace forced the door open, the wind and rain rushing in like a tidal wave. She pushed through the storm, holding Eerie close, the house's cries following them into the night. The windows, still weeping, watched them go, the voices fading into the distance. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the property. The rain still fell, but it was just rain now, not the tears of a mourning house. Grace looked back at the old house, its windows still streaked with the remnants of its sorrow. She knew they could never return. The house was alive with grief, a sorrow so deep that it had taken on a life of its own. It had tried to trap them, to make them a part of its endless mourning. But Grace had escaped, though the sadness of the house would linger with her forever. The memory of the weeping windows, the voices of the lost souls, would haunt her for the rest of her days. There are moments when the world seems to close in, when the air thickens with dread. Charles experienced such a moment on a night when the rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the world into a dark, watery blur. Alone on a desolate highway, his gas gauge dangerously close to empty, he knew he needed to find a gas station soon. The road stretched on, dark and empty, the rain swallowing the light from his headlights. Just as panic began to set in, Charles spotted a dim, flickering light in the distance. A gas station, its neon sign barely glowing against the storm. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The gas station was eerily quiet as Charles pulled in. No other cars, no signs of life. The only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain on the metal roof of the station. He stepped out of his car, pulling his jacket tight against the cold, and made his way to the pump. As he began to refuel, something caught his eye. Just beyond the reach of the station's flickering lights, in the darkness where the rain seemed to fall even harder, were shadows. At first, he thought they were just tricks of the light, but as he stared, they became more defined. Human-like figures standing motionless in the storm. A chill ran down Charles's spine. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling himself it was just his imagination, a result of the storm and the isolation. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the figures. They were too real, too present. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, barely visible through the wall of rain, as if waiting for something. Charles's heart began to pound. He quickly finished refueling and moved toward the station's small convenience store, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was going on. The store was just as deserted as the rest of the station. Shelves were stocked with dusty cans and old snacks, but there was no sign of the attendant. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp and decay, as if the place had been abandoned for years. Yet everything was still running. The lights, the coolers, even the flickering neon sign outside. Charles's unease grew into full-blown fear. He could feel the presence of the figures outside, pressing in on the small station, waiting for him to step back out into the storm. He moved toward the door, intending to leave as quickly as possible, but stopped when he saw something that made his blood run cold. The windows of the store, streaked with rain, began to fog up. But this wasn't normal condensation from the storm. Words were being written in the fog, slowly, deliberately. Get out? Charles didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted for the door, his heart racing, his mind filled with terror. As he stepped outside, the figures were closer now. They had moved, inching closer to the station's light. He ran to his car, the rain soaking him to the bone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures seemed to shift, their outlines growing sharper, more menacing. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense their hunger. They were waiting for him to make a mistake, to step too far into the darkness. Charles fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He could feel the figures closing in, could hear the faintest whisper of their voices carried on the wind. The car door finally unlocked, and he threw himself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it immediately. The engine roared to life, and Charles floored the accelerator. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures standing at the edge of the light, their forms barely visible through the rain. But they weren't gone. He could still feel them, could still sense their presence. The rain seemed to intensify, as if trying to pull him back. The figures would never let him escape. And in the end, Charles knew, he would always be running,